what I've tried to do is, as your title was asking for, to unlock some of the metacognition, try to think of it from a theoretical evidence perspective, but also blend in some of the practical case studies that the exemplification that we've got, and hopefully then leave you with an opportunity to consider what this looks like again in your context. So first part, I've got 4 sections. The first part is very short, but I just really feel that considering aspects about learning, thinking, memory just activates from where you've just come from what I've just heard. We'll then look at unlocking the metacognition, self-regulated learning. Then we'll consider promoting it in the classroom, and then one final slide on professional growth. I'll pause in as we go through for a couple of thinkings, and hopefully then you get a chance to consider it at the end if I understand the section well. So first slide in. Essentially, I think the biggest thing in our gift as a teacher or an educator is this part about growing stronger relationships to learning. If we can be doing that day in, day out, then the children are going to thrive and take themselves further forward. So I've just drawn here, if it's about growing stronger relationships to learning, then it's really key to make sure we understand what learning is in the context. So I'm using here Kirshner, Sweller and Clark's definition that learning is a change in long-term memory. The other one I love that we've used is Professor Rob Coe. Learning happens when you have to think hard. It's that frown on the forehead. And how can we be encouraging and motivating children to be enjoying that and having strong relationships to that? And I know that you've been just hearing about the short-term memory. That bit from Daniel Willingham, memory is the residue of thought. So therefore, what we're talking about, metacognition, is not seen on its own, but it's a key part of all those elements there, I'd suggest. The other part that strikes us is this work by Chi, Meltovitz and Glaser, that beginners aren't little experts. As a novice in something, we know less and think differently to experts as an adult or a child, but that piece of we know less and think differently. And therefore, this part about what we as teachers can hopefully do is making the implicit explicit. And that's something I'm going to come back to as we go through to consider when we're in our classrooms, how what we do explicitly can grow stronger relationships to learning and through develop metacognitive approaches. So that's that first section, which I hope has just given a context. And now I'll just move into this part about unlocking the metacognition. Just for awareness, this graph here comes from the Teaching Learning Toolkit from the Education Endowment Foundation. And these along the bottom here are interventions that have been tested through rigorous evidence trials in the past and ongoing. Metacognition self-regulation here at the left-hand side has one of the strongest impact sizes. 7 months impact for low cost and extensive evidence. It tends to suggest, like feedback here at the just above it, that what happens in the classroom makes the biggest difference. And therefore, our role as teachers should be to really make sure that we're considering how that evidence can be brought alongside our practice and our experience. So metacognition is part of the fabric of successful learning, but it can prove both complex and subtle. It's an ever-present part of the classroom, but unless we have a strong understanding of the demands of the topic, the metacognitive demands and the cognitive demands of the topic, we may miss opportunities to develop our pupils' knowledge and skills. I would say at this stage that, metacognition is not a panacea. It absolutely does not replace subject knowledge or memory and is best developed within subjects in the context of subjects. Briefly, 4 misconceptions. If you a moment, I'll pause and give you a moment to read them. So of those 4 there, I think, in the context of the school that we're talking in, it's absolutely metacognition is evident from the very earliest ages, isn't it? We know that, and evidence suggests that it is absolutely developed from the earliest ages. It is absolutely a skill that should not be separated from subject knowledge, and it really should be making sure that it's integrated within what we do. And from hearing what you're talking about, just as I came in, I can hear that's where you are already. This particular diagram here is, as a geographer myself, I used to find defining terms really helpful. Now, I'll refer to the Education Endowment Foundation guidance later, but this one here is from John Mannion, Metacognition, Self-Regulation, Self-Regulated Learning. What's the difference? It's from the Charter College of Teaching Impact Journal. I found it a really useful diagram, and one that Luke and I had discussed previously when he sent me something. I like to see the three elements here. On the number one, the metacognition. Monitoring and controlling what's in your head, your thought processes. I found that a really useful way of shaping it. The EF talk about the ways learners monitor and purposely direct their learning. What's in your head and how you monitor your thought process is just another way of suggesting it, isn't it? The second part is that self-regulation is a separate part to metacognition, and that's a key part about monitoring and controlling how you interact with your environment through emotions and behavior. It's a separate, but it becomes a linked element, doesn't it, when we talk about self-regulated learning. So the two become key parts of self-regulated learning, because it's about the application of that metacognition and the self-regulation to learning. So I found that as a useful diagram for me to use when I'm talking with pupils, students, and also staff and parents when we're thinking about discussing metacognition and where it sits with pieces. There's one other part that the EF use significantly, and that's the place motivation plays. And I haven't included it on here, and that's in the context of the half an hour. But that piece about motivation is so crucial, isn't it? Intrinsic or extrinsic motivation, the balance between them. One part that we're really interested in looking at the moment is the way that achievement influences motivation rather than the other way around. So if we can be securing opportunities for pupils to achieve, that supports the intrinsic motivation to do even better and move on. And hence the strapline again, securing a stronger relationship to learning. And we feel at the moment, we're as schools ourselves and with those we work with, that has never been more important than post lockdown and moving through into the next phases of education. Just going to pause now and just ask you to consider that question. Now, Luke, I think you said you might be able to call on people just to cold call and get a few ideas. I wonder if that's a chance to do that in a moment.
Absolutely. So, Andy, is that right? We'll have a small discussion in our groups now, and then we'll feedback.
Is that okay? So if you, just a couple of minutes and then just feedback.
Okay, go ahead, teachers.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll call on a few people now. So
thank you.
If I say year 3, anyone in year 3 who's ready, please contribute.
Yeah, sorry, I had my stuff turned off. I think a self-regulated learner is somebody who can look at kind of their learning and understand kind of where they're at with it. So if they're struggling with something, they can understand that they're struggling with it, and they can call on strategies that they've used or that they know that they can use and apply them. So they're struggling with a maths problem, they might think back to something that's helped them before and then apply it to that particular problem.
Thank you. Really helpful, and that'll chime really, won't it, in a moment. Any others?
Year 4, can you build or challenge that?
Thank you.
So we were saying, so similar, that can reflect on own learning, and sometimes you see it with children doing it by they're mumbling to themselves or they're talking to themselves, and also just not on their strengths but their weaknesses, which is quite hard to do. And then also have implicit and explicit techniques when they're under stress, so they know how to calm themselves down and how to regulate their feelings as well, because that will influence learning.
Thank you so much for both those contributions, and I think you'll see in a moment if I move the slide on one, it so resonates with, I hope you can see that, it's a quote from Zimmerman, his work in 2010. I'm not sure if you're further away from the screen, I think I saw a few of you further away from the screen, that learners are proactive in their efforts to learn because they are aware of their strengths and limitations. That was something that just came out of there. I love the part about, especially under stress in that way, in terms of the stress a new situation brings. The idea of self-talk, because they're personally setting goals and task-related strategies. And the last part I underlined is that they monitor their behaviour in terms of their goals and self-reflect on their increasing effectiveness. So Luke will have a PDF of these slides, and hopefully that's something that you can reflect on further if you wish to, but it only, I would suggest, resonates with what you just described there. Redirecting to what they can call on, the self-talk, and that strengths and weaknesses and what they can do in new situations. Thank you. So having just considered that, what the EF guidance report does, it provides a range of resource that I think you've had for pre-reading, so I'm not going to dwell too long on it, rather looking at the impact and how we can utilize it. But you've got the guidance report itself, which is free to download from the EF. You've got the recommendations here, the 7 recommendations we'll mention in a moment. But then you've also, in case you haven't seen it yet, there is also on the website, over lockdown, the EF worked with a number of people to consider how this looked for remote learning. And they came up with distilling the recommendations into a 5-step process, not to be done every lesson, but want something that can be supporting not only remote learning, but also back in schools as well. So that might be something you look at, the way that activate, explain, practice, reflect and review. And one of the pieces, the hardest bit to maybe do online, was that bit about the practicing. And the bit that maybe we tend not to do if we're in a rush is provide opportunities to reflect. So that's something that I'll make sure I put as a link for you, Luke, to that most recent piece about home learning there. The recommendations, we're not going to go through all of them, but I like to look at them as the number 1 and number 7 are, if you like, bookends. Tonight, what we're looking at here is number 1, that the teachers should acquire the professional, teachers should understand how the professional understanding and skills to develop their pupils' metacognitive knowledge. That's the first, that's why we're here doing this tonight, isn't it? And Luke's work and the work of the team and the schools that we work with, schools should support teachers to develop that knowledge so they can be applied appropriately. So they're the bookends, if you like, of the recommendations, because then in between those recommendations, we have these other 5 recommendations, and I'm in the course of the session here, I'm just going to pick off 2 of them. Number 2, which is about explicitly teaching pupils the metacognitive strategies. Don't know what's happening here, sorry. And number 3, about modeling your own thinking, and I've just heard that just described in the conversation I came in on. So we'll look at these 2 and 3, not because they're more important, but I just felt in the context of the brief I was given, I could exemplify some of that in what we've got here. Now, I shared this from Luke, and I just thought that what it does, what I'm going to enter into now in the second half of the input, absolutely chimes with what you have here in terms of the plan, monitor, evaluate process that's clearly identified here. And at the top there, how about learner, strategy and task are combined and overlap in this way. So this is a model that doesn't appear in the guidance report from the Education Endowment Foundation, but it's one that represents the cycle of metacognitive regulation. I found it really useful when we've been talking with teachers and providing 2 avenues to look in. First off, it's considering metacognitive knowledge, So at the top here. And that is broken down into knowledge of task, knowledge of strategies, and knowledge of self. So as year 2, I think it was talking about call on, what can they call on? A pupil here, a student here, is calling on their knowledge of the task, knowledge of their strategies that they might use, and knowledge of themselves as a learner. And we can all think of students or pupils who've got a strong grasp in those areas. We can also consider those pupils who haven't initially, and maybe those who've made huge strides in some of those pieces. At the bottom here, the metacognitive regulation sits alongside that, because that's about the planning, the monitoring and the evaluation of the task activity, how they're getting on, how they're going to actually go about it, how they're actually going to do when they're going through it, and as they're drawing to a close, how well, what were the strengths, what could be done even better next time. So all of this is postulated in this cartoon is either happening in the head of the pupil, or is that self-talk maybe. And as an adult, we're drawn to this as well. We are looking at, if I think about the session tonight, I've got a clear understanding of the task from Luke. I thought and discussed some strategies I might be able to utilize. And I know for myself what I'm comfortable doing and what I'm having to learn about doing in this remote context. So I'd have loved to have been there in person as we planned this a good number of months ago. And then for my metacognitive regulation, I've been planning this. I'm monitoring it. I'm finding that really hard now because I can't see you. I'm talking to my computer screen, and the evaluation I'm going to have to obviously consider at the end and consider from Luke, did it hit what we wanted it to hit? So this is going on all the time, isn't it? So just as a quick activity, I'm going to put something on the slide here. Luke, I'm not sure if if you have any Welsh members of staff.
We don't, do we? No.
Right. I thought a colleague of mine has used this with me before, and we've used it subsequently. That is Welsh. Now, what I'd like to do is just have a look at it and consider if I'd given you the challenge, the task of translating that. It's a knowledge of task. I'm asking you to translate that the best that you can. Now, clearly, we've not got much time, so just have a minute to consider translating that. Now, some of you might have dived for your phone and gone into Google Translate or something like that. But maybe if I just put these two pieces up here. So highlighting again at the top here, I hopefully gave you clarity of the task to translate it. You will then immediately have thought, OK, what strategies can I draw upon? It might have been that you start to look through and look for capital letters, because those capital letters, or this looks like a name. OK, that's going to be a name of a person. Oh, here's another name of a person here, Adam Price. It might be then, oh, Liz Saville Roberts, that looks like a name. So we can start to piece together from what we know already. And knowledge of self, some of you might go, oh, I love a challenge like this. I love linguistics. I'm going to try and unpick it. Some of you might go, do you know what? I've just taught a full day, and what's he doing? Asking me to translate some Welsh. So this knowledge of self came into play immediately. And at the same time, you'll have been planning, you'll have been thinking, what might I do? How might I do it? And then very quickly monitoring and going, do you know what? Oh, do you know, it's too much. Or hang on, I'm on a run here. I can maybe start to put it together. And the evaluation you might consider at the end of it. Actually, I thought I rose to the challenge pretty well then. This is what it actually is I'm trying to draw at, is that what that task will have done is it's required, yes, the metacognitive approach, but it absolutely sits on cognition. You couldn't do that without understanding the act of translation, or the fact that decoding was going to become important. There was some political knowledge that would have helped you unpick that as well, about Clyde Cymru, for example. The vocabulary knowledge would have maybe helped thinking about the origins of words. Obviously, did you know Welsh? That would clearly have helped you. And also maybe some of the clues about syntax and grammar. So metacognition sits alongside and utilizes cognition, and therefore it's got to be taught and experienced within the concept of a subject, I would suggest. And that is where this metacognitive knowledge and metacognitive regulation comes alongside the cognition. To put you out of your misery, if you were in misery, this is what it translates to. So it just highlights again that you'll have started on something, you may have experienced success, you'd have had to think about strategies and employing them at a pace. So hopefully that's just started to exemplify some of that process that we're using and how quickly we're having to use it. Looking at this third section, I'm aware of time. Looking at this, I did say to Luke I'd try and minimize the input, but I find it so difficult to. I apologize. I find it a fascinating area. So this embedding it in the classroom. I'm going to come back to this model again. I think this is what this was one of the pieces that Amy had used. This is what I presented at Research Ed Norwich, was that this whole process of a teacher going alongside a pupil was all of a sudden on March the 23rd not possible because the vast majority of pupils were not in school, and therefore this pupil themselves was having to do this without the teacher along the side, giving the nudges, giving the steers to this. And I think it's made really clear to us again how what's in the gift of us as a teacher when pupils are in school to make the implicit explicit. If we can be modelling this, if we can be making sure that we're being clear to support the development of metacognitive strategies from the very earliest ages and self-regulation from the various ages, as you are, I know that, then it's got to be a good thing. So what does this look like in the situation we're talking about? This diagram here comes from the guidance report, and I find it very useful in considering growing strong relationships to learning. I am not, and the EF aren't suggesting you now have to move to a 7-part lesson. Please make sure that's understood. But this is happening over a period of time. The idea that if you move from early stages of activating prior knowledge through to structured reflection, the balance of relationship to learning, the demands on learning for the pupil are growing and the input from the teacher is diminishing. It's not to say you don't focus on it, but it's diminishing. And I've put up here a star on explicit strategy instruction. That is the piece, if we go back to this bit here on the diagram, which is about knowledge of strategies, we have the more that we can explicitly teach the strategies, the more the pupil has in their mental bank of experience and practice to recall on in their own time. And so therefore this part again, coming back again, making the implicit explicit, when we're explicitly teaching instruction about the strategy, is a piece that has got to have that durability for pupils and transferability. What I'm just going to do now, I don't have a dog, but dogs seem to always have a good piece. If we look at the top end, activating prior knowledge is all about retrieval, isn't it? That's why this dog sprang out at me. Learning scientists, I'm sure you've come across their resources, but if you haven't, even though they've been designed for origin from high school students in the US, they've done an increasing amount with pupils at a much lower age, increasingly at the youngest ages. And colleagues I've been working with early years have said, well, that's exactly what we do, Andy. The other part is this part from retrievalpractice.org. If you haven't seen this document, very short guide, but it's really useful about how to implement retrieval-based learning in early childhood education. So those two pieces there, that piece about retrieval, low-stakes quizzing, often referred to as a testing effect, is a strategy that helps pupils generate the answer to a question. And it's then that building and building and building that knowledge and that cognition and the understanding of a subject so they can then be metacognitive with it in that way. So really, really important element of what we do, isn't it? The second one, I heard this as I came into the meeting. I've skipped to the third level here, the modelling of a learned strategy, the power of modelling in the development from dependence through to independence. The I do, the clarity of exposition, the modelling, that might be visual with a visualizer. It might be verbally. I've seen teachers very effectively do it silently because they didn't want to add to the cognitive load on a particular piece. and then they talk it through once they've completed it, and that's helping the pupils develop their own self-talk as to why has the teacher done that. The routines developed around that are essential, but really fascinating the degree to which that modelling can be made fit for purpose. The I do, we do, you do, that whole piece around moving towards independence as a goal here. This is one that I hold dear to our heart. A lot of the work we've done around making best use of TAs, the strategic deployment of TAs. This is the work of Rob Webster and the team, and I know Rob Webster is well known to you. This piece here, the almost counterintuitive, least help first, using this scaffolding system has been something that we've seen schools really harness to the extent where pupils, even the youngest of pupils, say, oh, you're giving me a clue now, aren't you? So the idea being that hopefully we aspire that pupils are self-scaffolding. They can do it themselves. If they can't, we give them a prompt. What might you do next? What did you do last time? If the prompt is next, well, maybe we have to move to a clue. That cluing is a bit more specific because it has to relate to the context. It might be a question. And it might be that the cluing still doesn't work. And then that's where the modelling comes in. And that modelling is that contract. So, well, I'll do it, you follow, we'll then do it together, and then you're going to have a go at something similar. And that's that whole piece where you get more help from the TA or the teacher, going down if you like, but then the greater pupil independence is at the higher levels here. So that's a piece that for all involved in schools, not just teaching assistants at all, but for teachers and TAs to utilise the least help first as a way, three before me type pieces as well. Now this is an example I just found very, very useful. Now, okay, the level it was the Key Stage 3 one, but this is a work that was shared. This idea of how an example becomes a worked example, but then through careful fading, I love this concept of fading, the idea being that the pupil then ends up tackling a problem. So here's the work, we will do an example, here's the worked example. The faded example, you take some of the support away. And then there might be other compares in that way. So this idea of fading is to what degree do you reduce the worked exampleness of it in that way? It's probably not the right phrase, but that fading, I think, is a really interesting piece to consider what that looks like formally in teaching or maybe informally, so that pupils can then eventually solve the problems themselves. Fading, I think, is something that has got a lot of scope for teacher planning and collaborative planning about how that works. Here's another one, which is if we're thinking about this as guiding practice, this is the use of knowledge strips that actually start to help identify. You'll be able to see this on the PDF hopefully better if you're a long way from the screen. But you've got the ideas that you're providing the prompts and the steers. It's making the implicit explicit, making sure that the pieces are very clear that pupils can, if they need it, utilize. The independent practice piece is something that is so vital, but often the most challenging, especially remotely. But this may be and this is something that we've used maybe more at Key Stage 3, but the idea of and above is the effectiveness of the learning behaviours, as Dunlosky puts across in Strengthening the Student Toolbox. Working through here, thinking about, once again, practice testing being one of the most high utility, biggest impact. The distributed or spaced practice, and maybe that elaborative interrogation, generating or explaining answers as to the why. But these are all pieces that we can be encouraging even the youngest of learners to be doing, isn't it? Someone just talked about the self-talk, the self-explanation, and how the idea of practicing and testing themselves, carefully think about practicing over space-time, it makes it useful. So I just thought I'd put a couple of ideas there for you. I hope that's capitalized on a few. I'm just going to put a couple of more up. I'll pause, give you a moment to read that. So I came in on the conversation, and I know you've had some wonderful input on working memory. The last sentence of this is important, I feel, and we shouldn't expect pupils to develop new cognitive and metacognitive skills at the same time. That's something that we can consider when we're considering our instruction and the sequencing of our learning for our pupils. So I just think it's a really pertinent point that links from what you've gone from previously and into today, that piece around making sure that the job of our teachers is to make sure that we're considering that balance. It's not making things easier, it's just carefully considering when it happens. On to the last couple here now, literally the last couple. Structured reflection may be something we don't give enough time to, is the conversation I've been hearing from many members of staff. But that structured reflection can be as simple but as powerful as some purposeful questions. So this is from Inner Drive, a particular group you may have come across, and they do some of these very simple pieces but drawn on the psychology of it. And once again, you see here the planning, monitoring, evaluating. That is the poster that you kindly shared for me. It brings it right back down to this again, doesn't it? Questions that we can encourage ourselves to ask and encourage our pupils to be asking, and actually monitoring, narrating this explicitly, as with all that we've just described ahead. The teacher narrating what's in their head. So not leaving it in their head, but actually narrating it. That teacher talk is so powerful when done effectively. Example from colleagues at Notre Dame High School. I put this in purely because Nikki Kaiser, a colleague there, I learned so much from her in terms of how she goes about the use of evidence in that way. Now, yes, this says this is A-level, this is geography A-level, but you see here that the concept is the same, the planning, the monitoring, the evaluation, with some prompts, some steers, some questions that can be actually used to help understand the metacognitive cycle here. Now, yes, it's at A-level, but the questions, the idea, the notion of the questions, I think sits for everybody in that way. So that was just one resource she'd been using. This is another one here, which I particularly liked, we've seen used well. Feedback from a simple quiz or an assessment. First off, tell me what one question you got wrong. And this was done on a Google Doc. Why did you choose that answer? Okay. And what was the actual correct answer? So what this teacher has done there, they've sought to understand which was the area they were unsure of, why did they have that misconception, and what was the actual correct answer? Have they grasped what the actual answer should have been? And then, do you have any questions about the topic? I thought a really interesting way that I've seen used to develop that metacognitive approach, and the idea being, and Nikki eloquently puts it, as about what's the point of correcting mistakes if they're going to do exactly the same the next day? What we should be seeking with metacognition is helping them do something really well so that they can do it even better again when we're not there. So coming to the end, I'm sorry I went just over there, 6 minutes over. The professional growth, there's plenty out there, and I've just put a few pieces together here. I'm sure you've seen a good number of them, and you've got some fabulous resource, I know, from your own professional growth in the school. There's a guidance report. Impact nearly always has something, and there's some superb articles that are available. I know you're fully fledged members of the Chartered College of Teaching, and therefore do dip into those. Here's the retrievalpractice.org. I found that really interesting. The Cambridge assessment is maybe for ITTs or NQTs getting into it is a good place to start. The Inner Drive is quite an interesting selection. There's a guide there that's there. The other part is the EF have a weekly news and a weekly email series. You might wish to subscribe to that about metacognition if you're thinking about it at another level. And this book here, Kate Jones, has got some great pieces in it. So I just thought I'd share those with you. I hope that's been of interest. It's tried to bridge the gap between evidence and classroom practice, drawing out, strengthening the links to learning, and making the implicit explicit.